Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahu bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin. Allahumma la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to lesson number 6 of the video series Arabic Grammar for Understanding the Quran. Now, I know the past few lessons have been quite long, so I've intentionally decided to shorten this lesson, and this will give us all a chance, hopefully, to catch our breath and to do some revision if necessary. Here are the contents for today's lesson. In lesson number 5, we covered verb forms 2, 3, 4, and 5. Today, we'll be finishing up our discussion of the awzan by looking at verb forms 6, 7, 8, and 10. Afterwards, we'll be talking about the Arabic dual, the muthanna. We'll be learning the Arabic dual pronouns as well as the Arabic dual verb conjugations. And finally, we'll close with a quick review of verbs. Verb form number 6. The pattern for verb form number 6 is تفاعل يتفاعل التفاعل تفاعل يتفاعل التفاعل. What additions do we have? We have a ta fixed to the very front, and we also have an alif attached to the first root letter. So that gives us an elongation. And this looks basically like verb form number 3, فَعَلَ, except with the ta in front. So verb form number 6 adds reciprocity or mutual exchange to the form 3 meaning. تفاعل. An example would be if we have the verb عاون, form 3 verb عاون, which means to help. تعاون in form 6, تعاون يتعاون التعاون would mean to help each other or to cooperate. So the masdar at-ta'awun means cooperation. Now keep in mind, these descriptions of verb form meanings are not absolute rules. So they're not hard and fast requirements. They're basically guidelines and principles. So sometimes they may apply, sometimes they won't apply. It really depends on the verb itself. Here are some examples of form 6 verbs found in the Quran. تبارك يتبارك التبارك, to be blessed or praised. تساءل يتساءل التساؤل, to ask one another. So here we have the meaning of exchange and reciprocity. تعارف يتعارف التعارف, to get to know one another or each other. So again, when we're learning these verb forms, we want to train ourselves to listen to the unique characteristics of each verb. So for form 6, that would be listening for that ta and listening for that elongation in the middle of the verb itself. تفاعل يتفاعل التفاعل. Let's go through the conjugation of one form 6 verb with the root letters ba, dal, and lam. That would give us تبادل, which means to exchange mutually. تفاعل تبادل. تفاعلوا تبادلوا. تفاعلت تبادلت. تفاعلن تبادلن. تفاعلت تبادلت. تفاعلتم تبادلتم. تفاعلت تبادلت. تفاعلتن تبادلتن. تفاعلت تبادلت. تفاعلنا تبادلنا. Same verb in the present tense. يتفاعل يتبادل. يتفاعلون يتبادلون. تتفاعل تتبادل. يتفاعلن يتبادلن تتفاعل تتبادل تتفاعلون تتبادلون تتفاعلين تتبادلين تتفاعلن تتبادلن أتفاعل أتبادل نتفاعل نتبادل. So one thing you'll notice is that as the form number increases, as we move towards form 10, the verb becomes increasingly complex. So we're adding more features. And in general, the meaning of the verb also gains complexity. Here are some examples of Form 6 verbs found in the context of ayat from the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا تعارفوا to get to know each other. Example of Form 6 verb تبارك الذي نزل الفرقان على عبده. The verb تبارك في جنات يتساءلون يتساءلون. Form 6 وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى تعاونوا. Let's move on now to Form 7. The Form 7 pattern انفعل ينفعل الانفعال انفعل ينفعل الانفعال. The unique characteristic of Form 7 is that number one, we've added a hamza to the front of the past and the verbal noun. So we have a hamzatul wasl, infa'ala, infi'al. And also we've added a characteristic noon before the first root letter. So in all three cases, in the madi, the mudari, and the masdar, we have a noon. Infa'ala, yanfa'ilu, al-infi'al. So an easy way to remember Form 7 is to use a certain shortcut. In fa'ala has the noon sound. That corresponds to the end sound in Form 7. In fa'ala, Form 7. So this helps you remember. And this is actually a very useful way for us to distinguish between Form 7 and Form 8. It's easy to confuse those two. There's another shortcut for Form 8, which we will discuss later on. Form 7 usually contains the passive meaning, to be something. So an example would be the Form 1 verb قطع يقطع, which means to cut off or to chop off. If we change that to Form 7, we get انقطع ينقطع الانقطاع, which means to be cut off or to be severed. Let's look at some examples of Form 7 verbs from the Quran. انقلب ينقلب الانقلاب, which means to be turned or to return. انفض ينفض الانفضاد, which means to disperse or to be scattered. انبجس ينبجس الانبجاس, which means to gush forth. Past tense conjugation using the verb انقلب, we have انفعل انقلب انفعلوا انقلبوا انفعلت انقلبت انفعلنا انقلبنا انفعلت انقلبت انفعلتم انقلبتم انفعلتِ انقلبتِ انفعلتن انقلبتن انفعلت انقلبت انفعلنا انقلبنا. Present tense ينفعل ينقلب ينفعلون ينقلبون تنفعل تنقلب ينفعلن ينقلبن تنفعل تنقلب تنفعلون تنقلبون تنفعلين تنقلبين تنفعلن تنقلبن أنفعل أنقلب ننفعل ننقلب. Some Form 7 verbs taken from the Quran. وَإِذَا انقلبوا إِلَى أَهْلِهِمُ انقلبوا فَكِهِينَ, the verb انقلب. فانبجست منه اثنتا عشرة عينا, so we have the verb انبجس فانبجست. ولو كنت فظا غليظ القلب لانفضوا من حولك انفض ينفض, another Form 7 verb. Moving on to Form 8. The Form 8 pattern, افتعل يفتعل الافتعال افتعل يفتعل الافتعال. Now, similar to Form 7, we've added a Hamza al-Wasl, in the very front of the past tense and the verbal noun. So for the Maldi and the Masdar, we have a Hamza in the very front. Ifta'ala al-ifti'al. What we've also done is we've added a characteristic ta between the first two root letters. So smack in the middle of the verb, we find a ta. Ifta'ala yafta'ilu al-ifti'al. So this is the more important of the two characteristics, because we find it in the mudari' as well. It's basically present in all three cases. An easy way for us to remember Form 8 is that this ta gives us a t sound, ifta'ala, and that corresponds to the t sound in English, Form 8. Ifta'ala, Form 8. So for Form 7 we have infa'ala. For Form 8 we have ifta'ala. So the n and noon and the ta and t sounds are easy ways for us to remember Form 7 and Form 8. Just a coincidental correspondence in the English and Arabic phonetics. Now let's look at some examples of Form 8 verbs found in the Quran. اتبع يتبع الاتباع, which means to follow or to obey. اتخذ يتخذ الاتخاذ, to take. اهتدى يهتدي الاهتداء, to be guided. اتقى يتقي الاتقاء, to be on guard, or in the context of the Quran and Islam, to be conscious of and to fear Allah. So you'll notice that some of these verbs take a shadda on top of the ta, like ittaba'a, ittakhadha, ittaqa, and that's because of the root letters. So for ittaba'a we have ta, ba, and ayn. So ta is actually one of the root letters, the radicals. For ittakhadha, one of the radicals is hamza, kha, and dha. And the ittaqa, we have a waw, actually, a waw, qaf, and a ya. So when you have cases where the radicals, the first radical of the verb is a ta or a hamza or a waw, we have to use a shadda in Form 8. We have to use a shadda. This is a transformation dictated by phonetics, so we won't go into the details, but what you want to do is pay attention for a shadda that comes in the front of the verb, a shadda on top of a ta. That is a telltale sign of a Form 8 verb. Conjugation practice using the verb ikhtalafa, which means to defer. افتعل اختلف افتعلوا اختلفوا افتعلت اختلفت افتعلنا اختلفنا افتعلت اختلفت افتعلتم اختلفتم افتعلت اختلفت افتعلتن اختلفتن افتعلت اختلفت افتعلنا اختلفنا. Present tense. يفتعل يختلف يفتعلون يختلفون تفتعل تختلف يفتعلن يختلفن تفتعل تختلف تفتعلون تختلفون تفتعلين تختلفين تفتعلن تختلفن أفتعل أختلف نفتعل نختلف. So again, pay attention to the characteristic ta found in the middle of the verb between the first and the second radicals. That ta is the main characteristic of the form 8 verb. So form 8 is fairly common in the Quran. Unlike forms 6 and 7, those tend to be a bit more rare, but form 8 you find all over the place. وَيَشْتَرُونَ بِهِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. The verb اشترى يشتري is a form 8 verb. اصبروا وصابروا ورابطوا واتقوا الله, part of the last ayah of Ali Imran, as a command form. This is a form 8 verb. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا ظَنَّ وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. يَتَّبِعُونَ, to follow, form 8 verb. اتَّبَعَ يَتَّبِعُ, al-ittiba'. And from Surah Yunus, فَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنِ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. Iftara, which means to invent or to fabricate, also a form 8 verb. So again, you want to look for a ta in the middle of the verb, such as in ikhtalafa or in ijtama'a, or you're looking for a ta with a shadda on top, like in yattabi'una, wattaqa. These are usually indications of form 8 verb. So now for form 10, the last and final form. Form 10 has a much longer and complex form structure. We have istaf'ala yastaf'ilu al-istif'al. Istaf'ala yastaf'ilu al-istif'al. We've added quite a few things. Number one, we've placed a hamza in the front of the past and the verbal noun, just like we did for forms 7 and 8. Istaf'ala and istif'al. Moreover, we've added a sin and a ta before the first root letter. So we have istaf'ala, hamza, sin, ta, yastaf'ilu, sin and ta, wal istif'al, hamza, sin and ta. So in the past tense, in the madi, we have three things going on. Hamza, sin and ta before the radicals show up later on. Form 10 has a few different abstract meanings. Number one, to seek or to request, to do the form 1 meaning. To seek or to request. So an example would be istakhara yastakhiru al-istikhara. Istakhara means to seek khair, to seek goodness. So the prayer al-istikhara, salat al-istikhara, is a prayer that we perform when we are seeking khair from Allah, when we're seeking divine guidance before we make big decisions in our life. Another possible meaning of form 10 is to consider or to deem. To consider someone to have form 1, the qualities of the form 1 verb. Some examples of form 10 verbs. This is a typo. Form 10 verbs found in the Quran. Ista'jala yasta'jilu al-isti'jal. Ista'jala yasta'jilu al-isti'jal, which means to seek, to hasten. The form 1 verb means to hasten. Put in form 10, ista'jala means to seek, to hasten. Istaghfara yastaghfiru al-istighfar, a very common verb, which means to seek forgiveness. And then we have istakbara yastakbiru al-istikbar, to be proud or to be arrogant. Past tense conjugation for form 10 using the root letters ghain, fa and ra. Istaghfara, which means to seek forgiveness. We have istaf'ala, istaghfara. Istaf'alu, istaghfiru. Istaf'alat, istaghfarat. Istaf'alna, istaghfarna. Istaf'alta, istaghfarta. استفعلتم استغفرتم استفعلتي استغفرتي استفعلتن استغفرتن استفعلت استغفرت استفعلنا استغفرنا. So you'll notice that these verbs are very long. There's a lot of stuff going on in there in Form 10. Okay, it gets even longer here. For the present tense, يستفعل يستغفر يستفعلون يستغفرون تستفعل تستغفر يستفعلن يستغفرن تستفعل تستغفر تستفعلون تستغفرون تستفعلين تستغفرين تستفعلن تستغفرن أستفعل أستغفر نستفعل نستغفر. So in Form 10, we're listening for and paying attention to the sin and the ta, those extra additions in the verb. Form 10 verbs found in the Quran. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين in Surah Al-Fatiha. نستعين from the verb استعان, and this means to seek help, to seek help. فإذا جاء أجلهم فلا يستأخرون ساعة ولا يستقدمون. We have two instances of the Form 10 verb, يستأخرون and يستقدمون. ثم أفيضوا من حيث أفاض الناس واستغفروا الله. استغفر, Form 10. And finally, يستخفون من الناس ولا يستخفون من الله, the verb يستخفون. So this officially concludes our discussion of the awzan patterns, the verb forms and patterns. Here is a summary chart for all the different forms that we've covered. We've covered 9 of the major forms. You'll notice that Form 9 is actually missing, so we jumped from 8 to 10. We've skipped out on Form 9, and that's because Form 9 is rarely used. It's rarely used in the media, in books. It's also not very common in the Quran. It shows up around 10 times in the entire Quran, so I chose not to cover it. I cannot emphasize enough how important and how crucial it is for you to know these verb forms by heart. The maldi, the masdar, the mudari, and the masdar as a set for each form. The awzan, this chart allows you to conjugate verbs. It allows you to use the Hans Wehr dictionary to look up different words. It allows you to predict the meanings. It allows you to make derivations like ism fa'il and ism maf'ul, etc., etc. So try your very best to commit these to memory. And like I mentioned in the previous lesson, the best 2 strategies are: number 1, to repeat across, like this. Form 5, تفعل يتفعل التفاعل, and to emphasize those unique sounds to each verb. So in Form 5, that would be the shadda. In Form 6, that would be the ta and the elongation. Right? So Form 5 and 6, if you slur them, tafa'ala, they sound really close. So what you want to do is you want to elongate that alif in Form 6. Tafa'ala versus tafa'ala. And number 2, to use examples. Okay, so look at examples of each of the forms. Inshallah, these 2 strategies will help you memorize this chart. Okay, it's now time for us to switch gears and to move on to topic number 2, al-muthanna, the dual. So here we have our pronoun chart. Again, the pronouns are organized by person, number, and gender. We've seen this a few times in the past. We'll be filling in the middle column for the dual pronouns. So we have huma for the masculine third-person dual pronoun. So this is used when you're referring to 2 individuals in the third person. So if you see 2 men walking down the street and you want to talk about them, you would use the pronoun huma yadhhabani fi shadi'. That is actually the same pronoun we use for the feminine counterpart, feminine third-person dual. So if you see 2 women walking down the street, you would also refer to them as huma. And then the pronouns for the second person, masculine and feminine, are also identical. We have antuma. So we have anta, antuma, antum. Anti, antuma, antunna. So antuma would be used when you are directly addressing two individuals, both in the masculine and in the feminine. Now, how do we distinguish between the genders if the pronouns are the same, if they are both huma and both antuma? The answer is based on context. So context will give you the clues and indications to tell us what gender is being used. So huma again means they two, and antuma means you two. Let's now take a look at the verb conjugations for the dual. We'll be starting out with al-madi, the past tense. So here we have huwa fa'ala, hum fa'alu. In the middle for the dual we have huma fa'ala, huma fa'ala. So it's basically the same as the huwa, except we've added an alif. So we just make that lam a little bit longer. Huma fa'ala. An example would be huwa dhahaba, huma dhahaba. Or huwa qatala, huma qatala. In the hiya, or in the feminine form, we have hiya fa'alat, huma fa'alata, huma fa'alata. So what we've done here is we've removed the sukoon, we've added fatha, and then we've also added an elongation, a long alif to the end. Huma fa'alata, hiya dhahabat, huma dhahabata. Or hiya qalat, huma qalata. On to the second person verbs in the madi. We have anta fa'alta, antuma fa'altuma, fa'altuma. And that's also the same case with the feminine second person. Anti fa'alti, antuma fa'altuma. So you'll notice that for the second person, the endings of the past tense verbs correspond to the pronouns. Anta fa'alta, antuma fa'altuma, antum fa'altum, anti fa'alti, antuma fa'altuma, antunna fa'altunna. So fa'altuma is the same for both genders. An example would be anta dhahabta, antuma dhahabtuma, dhahabtuma. As for the present tense, al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu', we have huwa yaf'alu, huma yaf'alani, yaf'alani. For the feminine version, we have hiya taf'alu, huma taf'alani, taf'alani. So besides the front, we have a ya for the huwa and a ta for the hiya. We also have a lani. We've added this to the end of the verb. Huma yaf'alani or huma taf'alani. For the second person dual pronouns, anta taf'alu, antuma taf'alani. And this is also the same verb that we would use in the feminine case. Antuma taf'alani. So you'll notice that the verb taf'alani is repeated a total of 3 times in our chart. We have huma taf'alani, third person feminine dual, as well as antuma taf'alani for the second person dual, masculine and feminine. So this comes up a total of 3 times. And again, context would indicate which situation, which case we are referring to. So the dual al-muthanna isn't very common in the Quran. You're not going to find it in too many places, but it does make a few significant appearances in some surahs. So for example, in the stories about Musa and Harun, you'll find the dual because we're talking about 2 individuals. Or in the story of Musa and Khidr in Surah Al-Kahf, you'll find al-muthanna. And another case is also in Surah Al-Kahf, the story about the owner of the 2 gardens. وَاضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلَ الرَّجُلَيْنِ جَعَلْنَا لِأَحَدِهِمَا جَنَّتَيْنِ. So in that story you'll find the muthanna, and also in other scattered places in the Quran. So when you do hear the dual, it's impossible to miss, right? Because you have some characteristic features of the dual that stand out. So one of those features is the alif at the end. There's an alif. So the dual pronouns and the dual verbs all have an alif at the end. when reading the Quran or listening to its recitation, pay attention for that alif. Be on the lookout for it. So, فَعَلَا, an extension, elongation at the end. فَعَلَتَا, فَعَلْتُمَا, أَنْتُمَا, تَفْعَلَانِ, يَفْعَلَانِ, and هُمَا. There's a shared alif in all these cases. What are the dual verb case endings in the present tense? The dual verbs present tense case ending markers are exactly the same as those markers for verbs conjugated for anti, antum, and hum. So as a reminder, that marker for the marfu' will be thubut and noon, the presence of the noon, and the marker for the mansub and the majzum will be hadth and noon, dropping the noon. So all 5 of these verbs, i.e. those verbs conjugated for hum, antum, anti, humma, and antuma, all 5 of them are collectively called al-af'al al-khamsa. Al-af'al al-khamsa, because of their shared markers. And al-af'al al-khamsa, this phrase literally means the 5 verbs. So their case endings all revolve around the noon, the presence of the noon in the marfu' and the absence or elimination of the noon in the majzum and the mansub. So let's go through the case endings in a little bit more detail in this slide. On the far right, we have the marfu' yaf'aluna, taf'aluna, and taf'alina. We've seen this in lesson number 5. Now we can add the 2 dual verbs, yaf'alani and taf'alani. So that gives us a total of 5 verbs. And all 5 have thubut and noon, the presence of the noon, as the marfu' marker. Now this noon can be dropped in the mansub and the majzum. So if we add a nasib such as an or lam ta'lil, we have an yaf'alu li yaf'alu, an taf'alu li taf'alu, an taf'ali li taf'ali. What happens when we add the nasib in front of the dual verb? We get an yaf'ala. We drop the noon. Li yaf'ala. Same case for taf'alani. An taf'ala. Li taf'ala. And in the majzum, when we add a jazim, okay, so the marker for the mansub is dropping the noon, and then in the majzum, we get lam yaf'alu, li yaf'alu. Same case, we've dropped the noon, hadf and noon. Lam taf'alu, li taf'alu. Lam taf'ali, li taf'ali. So this is lam or lam al-amr. Same case happens to our dual verbs. Lam yaf'ala, li yaf'ala, or lam taf'ala, li taf'ala, dropping the noon. So hopefully this slide clarifies the case ending markers for al-af'al al-khamsa. Again, to review, in the marfu' we have the presence of the noon, that is the marker. But in the mansub and the majzum, we have to drop the noon. Let's now take a look at some examples of al-muthanna found in the Quran. Example number 1. فَأَرَادَ رَبُّكَ أَن يَبْلُغَ أَشُدَّهُمَا وَيَسْتَخْرِجَ كَنزَهُمَا. We have 2 instances of the dual in the mansub, al-fi'l mudari' al-mansub. The reason is we have the an, so we have يَبْلُغَ. In the marfu' this will be يَبْلُغَانِ, and then we have يَسْتَخْرِجَ. In the marfu' this will be yastakhrijani. And by the way, this is a form 10 verb. So in both cases we have to drop the noon. We have hadf and noon because of the nasib an. Example number 2. Yuridani ay yukhrijakum min ardikum. We have the verb yuridani, form 4. And we hear that alif, yuridani, that elongation. This is al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu'. It's the default case because there are no special factors around, and the marker would therefore be thubut and noon, presence of the noon. فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. This is tukadhibani, conjugated for antuma, you two. The case is marfu' and the marker is thubut and noon. So why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using the muthanna in this case? It's because Allah is addressing both men and jinn. men, and jinn. So two entities are being addressed by this question. فَبِأَيْ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ, and that's why the dual is used, تُكَذِّبَانِ. Next example, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَا مَجْمَعَ بَيْنِهِمَا نَسِيَا حُوتَهُمَا. So here we have two instances of al-muthanna in the past tense. We have بَلَغَا and نَسِيَا. These are conjugated for huma in the masculine form, and these are in the maldi, so we don't have a marker because the maldi is mabni, it's fixed. قَالَتَا أَتَيْنَا طَائِعِينَ. We have قَالَتَا. This is conjugated for huma, but the feminine version. So we have قَالَتَا. Again, in the maldi, no marker because it is mabniya. And the last example, يُرِيدَانِ أَن يُخْرِجَاكُم مِّنْ أَرْضِكُمْ. This is a repeat of a previous ayah. So now we're focusing on the second dual verb, يُخْرِجَا. This is in the mansub case, al-fi'l mudari' mansub, because of the nasib an yukhrijakum, which means we have to drop the noon. So the marker is hadf an-noon. So that concludes our discussion of al-muthanna, the Arabic dual. Here is a quick review. I'll be presenting two diagrams or two schematics, two charts to summarize what we've covered in this lesson and the past lesson regarding markers and present tense cases. So again, this is a chart we've seen in lesson number 5, except we've updated part of it. So now we have all the pronouns accounted for. On the top, we have verbs conjugated for huwa, hiya, anta, ana, nahnu. The markers are our basic short vowels, dhamma for the marfu', fatha for the mansub, and sukun for the majzoom. On the bottom, we have the af'al al-khamsa, the 5 verbs. Those are the ones conjugated for hum, antum, anti, huma, and antuma. Al-af'al al-khamsa take the presence of the noon, thubut an-noon, as the marfu' marker, and hadf an-noon, dropping of the noon, for the mansub and the majzoom. So their markers revolve around the presence or the absence of the noon. As for the second diagram, I want to introduce briefly what I call the factor case marker system. Factor case marker. It's a 3-part system which I find very logical, accurate, and intuitive. So this is a very straightforward approach in grammatical analysis. What you're doing is you're asking yourself 3 questions. Number 1, what is the factor? Number 2, what is the case? Number 3, what is the marker? Factor, case, marker, in that exact order. So a lot of students like to jump around when they're doing i'rab. They like to go from the marker to the factor to the case, or the case to the factor to the marker, all sorts of stuff. And they invent their own reasonings and logic. And that is why oftentimes they have to resort to guesswork, okay, because there's no methodology. Here I present a very straightforward methodology. Factor, case, marker. If you follow the sequence and flow in that direction, you won't go wrong. So when we have no factors present, the case is the marfu', which means we have to use either a dhamma or a noon as the marker. So no factor, which means we have to use the marfu' case, which means we have to use a dhamma or a noon as the marker. If the factor is a naslib, such as lam, ta'lil, and an, that means we have to use the mansub case, which then means we have to drop the noon or we use a fatha. And finally, if we see a jazim like lam al-amr or lam, that means we have to use the majzoom case in the present tense, which further means we have to drop the noon or use the sukun. So hopefully this schematic makes intuitive sense, and hopefully you find this helpful. This brings us to the end of lesson number 6. Here's a quick review. We learned verb forms number 6, 7, 8, and 10. Each form again consists of a fixed past, present, and verbal noun pattern. So here's a chart summarizing the new verb forms that we just discussed. We also learned that the Arabic dual pronouns are huma and antuma, and we learned their present and past tense verb conjugations. And finally, we learned that the 5 verbs that take the following markers are called al-af'al al-khamsa. So those are the verbs conjugated for whom, antum, anti, huma, and antuma. Their shared markers revolve around the noon in the marfu', that is thubut and noon, the presence of the noon, and in the mansub and the majzoom, the marker will be hadf and noon, dropping the noon. Thank you for watching lesson number 6. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.